This is the Moral Science Podcast, and I'm your host, Amber Cazell. In this series, I get to interview experts in my favorite subject, the scientific study of human morality, virtues and vices, evolution of morals, the judgment-action gap, character development, the philosophy of morality, transcendent experiences, researchers' moral biases, cultural values, plus the obligatory trolley dilemma. We are going to talk about it all. Dr. Oliver Scott Curry is the research director of Kindlab and a researcher at Oxford School of Anthropology and Museum of Ethnography, as well as the London School of Economics Centre for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science. His work weaves philosophy, psychology, and anthropology together to tackle questions about the nature of human morality. In this episode, we discuss his theory of morality as cooperation and the evolutionary and game theory perspective that underpins it. We also compare and contrast his theory with moral foundations theory, Richard Shweder's Big Three ethics, and the relationship regulation theory of morality.
The first time I realised I was really interested in morality, we had a board game when I was a kid called Screwballs, which was like a moral dilemma version of Trivial Pursuit. And I remember thinking, you posed moral dilemmas to people and had to predict what they would say. And I remember thinking, these are really fascinating questions and I would really like to know what the right answer is. So I was always fascinated with morality and what's the difference between right and wrong and how can you tell. And when I went to university, the only place you could study it was in philosophy, and I actually ended up in a political science department, but at the sort of political theory end. And there, all the usual suspects we were reading from Plato to Nato, all arguing about political systems, but also human nature and whether people are naturally good or naturally bad and what you could and should do with them. And I remember thinking, this is all fascinating, but why are we working with ancient Greek theories of human nature when there's all this amazing work going on in the actual theory of human nature, in the evolution of humans and primatology, and in game theory and the evolution of cooperation and reciprocal altruism and all the rest. So I've always been interested in morality and where it comes from and how it works. But I followed the siren call of science to say, well, look, let's look at all these. If we're going to do this, let's do it properly. Let's use the latest and best theories of human nature. And so my PhD, for example, was on evolutionary accounts of morality, various different accounts. And at the end of my PhD, the short version is I kind of had enough of arguing the toss with philosophers and wanted to make a more substantial contribution to this field. So I through a roundabout route, I sort of retrained to do empirical work and ended up doing psychology experiments in an anthropology department.
Wow, that's very cool. So what was that roundabout retraining? How did you pull that off?
Well, it was the key was actually a very kind gesture by John Tooby and Lida Cosmopes, who I'd known for a while through mutual friends and conferences. And I think John could tell I wasn't quite sure what to do next, and he invited me to spend a semester or two in his lab, in their lab in Santa Barbara, the Center for Evolutionary Psychology. And that was an amazing experience for all kinds of reasons, but especially because I just got to see how to conceive of and conduct empirical studies, primarily psychology studies, but generally what empirical work consists of.
Yeah.
And I had a chance to put that into action with when I came back to the UK, with a series of postdocs where I was designing and running studies and learning and then teaching stats. So it was. I picked it up here and there, but I had a big boost from John and Lida.
Very cool. So with your theory of morality as cooperation, at what point did you start to kind of put that into words? It sounds like you were already working from that paradigm from a pretty early point.
Yeah, so it's really what my PhD was about, the sort of version one. And in my, which was 2005, so quite a while ago. And the point of the PhD was just to say, look, this is not a mystery anymore. There's nothing magical or strange about morality. We have a whole range of theories that explain what morality is and where it comes from and how it works. And I suppose initially it was initially a matter of just identifying a number of different theories in the literature. So theories of cooperation and altruism and pro-social behaviour. So obviously kin altruism and reciprocity, but also just reading a bit of game theory, reading a bit of John Maynard Smith, and realising, oh wow, there's a whole there's all these other types of cooperation, and they also explain bits of our social behaviour, and they also and that matches up with some of the things that philosophers celebrate as part of morality. So my PhD was really saying, look, there's a whole range of different theories here, and they're not competing with one another. They're complementary, and what they have in common is the underlying logic is they're all examples of ways of realizing mutual benefits, ways of solving, in game theory, non-zero sum problems. So here's a general framework with all these different types that encompasses all these different types of cooperation, explain all these different types of morality. So the basic argument was there with a few gaps in, and but like I say, it took me a while to figure out how to do empirical work and what kind of empirical work would be a sufficient vehicle to show off that theory, to show what it's capable of.
Yeah. Really interesting. So when I was reading through a book chapter of yours about morality as cooperation, I was wondering how you define cooperation. And just a minute ago, you said something about mutual benefit. So is cooperation, generally speaking, does that boil down to mutual benefit?
Yes. So I haven't invented any novel definitions. I would start with the game theory concept of a non-zero sum game. So a zero sum game is one where your gain is my loss. A non-zero sum game is one where we could both win. It's a win-win situation. In game theory, that's called a non-zero sum game. And there are it's not exactly clear how many games there are. There's a great book called I think it's called The Periodic Table of Games, and they try and map out all the hundreds of different games there are, different mathematically distinct types of social interaction there are, and they organise them in different ways. But at one point they say there's 12 different families of games.
Wow.
And many of those are non-zero sum games. So that's a really rich seam of information that I think people interested in morality are not really making the most of. But on my reading, there's at least 7 well-established types of cooperation that we have good game theory for, good evolutionary theory for, and that seem to be present in human behaviour. But there might be more, but there's at least 7.
Yeah, so let's talk about those 7. Could you go through kind of each of those with me and what examples are of each?
Sure. So, there's 7 types, and these are sort of labels for big categories. But so the categories are kinship, mutualism, social exchange, hawkishness, dovishness, division, and possession. And roughly speaking, they map onto. Well, so the first one is about kin selection and kin altruism, which explains why we love and care for our families and why we feel obliged to take extra special care of them. Mutualism is about the benefits of working in a team as opposed to working on your own. You achieve more together than by going it alone, and explains why we form groups, why we value our membership of those groups, why we resent people who leave and reduce the power of our group, especially if they leave to join a rival group. Social exchange is your gold standard reciprocity. Explains why we do people favours and why we expect those favours to be returned, and why we get angry or punish people that fail to return the favours, and a host of other sort of subcomponents like gratitude and guilt and forgiveness and apology. The rest are all examples of ways of resolving conflict, so minimizing the mutual costs of conflict. And this was actually the first. The analysis of the Hawk Dove game was the first example of someone using evolutionary game theory to explain social behavior. So this is what John Maynard Smith's papers in the early 70s are about. And the basic idea is you and I could have a fight over some resource, over territory or mates or food or something, and whoever was the strongest would win. But we both be injured from the fight. So instead of doing that, we show off how strong we are, we display our fighting ability, and if we flex our muscles at each other, and whoever has the smaller muscles backs off, then the outcome is the same. The stronger party still wins, but both benefit from, in terms of avoiding the mutual costs of the fight. This is a very widespread aspect of animal behaviour in general, and it gives rise to costly displays of prowess or cues of dominance and cues of submission, and gives rise to dominance hierarchies. And with us, that gives rise to costly displays of prowess like bravery and generosity, or conspicuous altruism, or sometimes called competitive altruism. And on the flip side, it gives rise to dovish displays of deference, of humility, of respect, of quietude, of being a good loser. Other ways to resolve disputes are to divide the resource rather than fight for all of it, so share it out fairly. And finally, number 7, another way of resolving disputes is to defer to prior ownership, so follow the rule, whoever got there first keeps it. So these are all just standard, well-established aspects of, these are all straightforward examples of cooperation in the literature, in the game theory, and in animal behaviour, and they map onto, humans look after their families, we form groups, we trade, we engage in heroic displays, we show deference to our superiors, we're fair, and we respect property. So all these sort of behavioural rules, if you like, are all ways of realising some mutual benefit, of solving some cooperative problem, and they just provide a sort of a menu of things that philosophers have celebrated as important parts of morality, of what it means to be good. So whether it's special obligations to kin, or group loyalty, or trust and reciprocity, or bravery, or respect, fairness, and the prohibition of theft, for example.
So that's all really interesting. And I'm wondering if you could connect the hawkish contest back to morality with me. This is the one that I think I have the trickiest time wrapping my mind around. So like if somebody is, showing off their muscles, for instance, to avoid a costly actual fight or contest, how does that connect with morality? Because for me, I don't usually think that if a fight is about to break out and somebody doesn't, show their prowess before that fight, I don't necessarily fault them morally for that. Although obviously fighting is itself not a good thing.
It's definitely one of these things. It's not like the others, but I think David Hume gave a very good account of it. So he distinguished between what he called the heroic virtues and the monkish virtues. So the heroic virtues were things like displaying how strong or brave or skillful or generous, or in some cases how beautiful you were. And the monkish virtues were, if you realised you'd been bested, showing humility and respect and obedience and so on. And I think so. His point is that by showing off those what he called shining virtues, these heroic virtues, if by showing them off you deter people from starting fights that they would ultimately lose to the mutual detriment of everyone, then that creates a common benefit. That promotes the common good.
Right.
But they are a bit different to other types of moralities, and so some philosophers talk about these kinds of virtues as supererogatory. So you're not blamed for not having them. You can't help it if you don't have strong muscles, or you're not in a position to show off by being conspicuously altruistic or something. But so they're kind of above and beyond the call of duty. But if you do have these traits, and if you do show them off in that way, then they're considered admirable and morally commendable.
And morally, what was that last part?
Morally commendable.
Okay.
So this, for example, is what Alistair MacIntyre talks about in his work on virtues. He says, modern moral philosophy has missed out, overlooks all the classical virtues, the things that Homer and Plato and Aristotle celebrated as part of morality. And he talked about all these same kinds of traits. And lo and behold, if you take a broader view of evolutionary game theory, there's a place for them right there. So the theories can accommodate those observations too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I almost wonder if it is like a timing or just living in a westernized country or something. It's still just hard for me to wrap my mind around this idea that people who look stronger, or like beauty was another example, something like that they're assigned more of a moral commendability or something like that. Is there evidence of that, in like empirical evidence, I mean?
Well, you're right in the sense that in living in modern Western societies where we've outsourced a lot of conflict resolution to a central authority, these things don't seem as important to us and don't loom as large. But if you're living in a smaller scale society where the onus is on you to protect yourself and your family, then these questions of whether you have a reputation, it's part of honor, of having that reputation of being able to defend, being strong enough to defend yourself, being strong enough to retaliate against injuries and slights, and having the capacity to retaliate, for example, can deter violence in the first place.
Right.
In terms of, but no, that's a good question. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not aware of work looking at whether people, certainly things like bravery people regard as morally good.
That's, yeah.
But whether it extends to the other virtues, and in which cultures, off the top of my head, it's a good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then, so let's dive into some of your critiques, or at least comparisons with other existing theories out there. So probably let's start with moral foundations theory, since I think a lot of listeners will be familiar with moral foundations theory by now. So how does your theory differ from or add anything to moral foundations theory?
Well, so one of the interesting things, one of the puzzling things is morality as cooperation. It's not the idea that morality has something to do with cooperation. It's not unique to me. Lots of people say that, including Jonathan Haidt and Alan Fisk and others. So there's kind of widespread agreement that the function of morality is to promote cooperation or solve these kinds of problems.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, the previous theories just haven't. I don't think they haven't done it properly. They haven't gone to the mathematics of cooperation to really flesh out this theory as much as they could. And moral foundations theory is a good example. So when in the papers where the theory is being developed, Jonathan Haidt explicitly, he says that he consulted a handful of sources to find some examples of what appeared to be widespread cooperation, and he certainly hit on a few. He certainly got a few of the answers right, But he missed out a whole bunch of other things that were right there in the literature waiting to be found. And I'd always put it the other way around. It's baffling to me how moral foundations theory, which presents itself as an evolutionary cooperative account of morality, doesn't have a domain dedicated to family. It doesn't have a domain dedicated to reciprocity. It conflates that with fairness, which are two different things. And it doesn't have any items asking about reciprocity in the questionnaire. It doesn't have a domain dedicated to, like we were saying, these kind of hawkish heroism, these costly displays of prowess, socially beneficial examples. And it doesn't have a domain dedicated to property, which is another very widespread aspect of cooperative behaviour in humans and other animals. So I can't think of a possible justification why an evolutionary account of morality would miss out these, the four of the most important types of cooperation.
Yeah, so the possession one, the idea of property, and prior ownership, to me that was kind of an eye opener as something that is pretty obviously missing. The other ones I want to flesh out a little bit more with you, because I feel like I kind of get glimmers of your perspective on this, and then I lose it. And so hopefully we can flesh that out and I'll be able to stick with it a little bit better. Because, like, for instance, you were saying, okay, reciprocity is not the same thing as fairness. And I do think that Haidt and his colleagues probably are thinking, well, yeah, it is the same thing, and this is just a language difference between you and I. And so I want to tear into some of those. Also, the authority one, the authority foundation, I assume they would think, well, that covers both the dovishness and the hawkishness, and then, he was built off of Shweder's work. So also Shweder's work, he talks a lot about how authority figures are supposed to care for the vulnerable that are under their care. And I think that they just think of these things of hawkishness and dovishness as two sides of the same coin, and they're just talking about the one coin. So I'm wondering if you can kind of tease apart how, like, what you would say to Jonathan Haidt or Richard Shweder if they were saying, well, I feel like it is covered in my theory.
Well, I mean, on the reciprocity, to start with reciprocity, I mean, reciprocity is a solution to a repeated prisoner's dilemma, whereas fairness is a solution to a hawk-dove game with a divisible resource. So they're two different games with two different solutions, and they occur together. So if you and I are haggling over the price of something, we are trying to resolve a conflict in the context of a reciprocal exchange, but they don't have to occur together. And if you and I are, just having a fight over, where my garden ends and your garden starts, and we agree, look, let's just split the difference. Let's just put a line down the middle. That's got nothing to do with reciprocity. That's just it's a different game with a different solution. Now, a proponent of moral foundations theory might want to argue that, well, no, I think these two things are the same, or the games are the same, but they'd be going against just textbook game theory. And also, why bother? Why pick that fight? It's completely unnecessary. And in terms of, what was the second one you said, in terms of?
Oh, like authority, yeah. And in-group, out-group with family.
Yeah, well, okay, so the in-group, out-group one is an interesting example. So both moral foundations theory and relational models theory, modes theory.
Ryan Fisk. Yes.
They both treat family as just another type of group. And although they don't, moral foundations theory doesn't in the questionnaire, it doesn't have any items asking about family in the group section. There's an item about family elsewhere. But families are not just another group. There's a different logic to them. Kin selection is not the same theory as coordination to mutual advantage or mutualism. They're two different theories that explain two different types of social behaviour that manifest themselves quite differently. And Alan Fisk's distinction is quite interesting because he, for reasons that escape me, he maps on his different types of social relationships onto scales of measurement, and he makes a big deal of how the starting one is one scale of measurement is categorical, and oh look, groups are categorical too. You're in the group or out of the group, and that's a bit of a giveaway because families aren't like that. Families aren't categorical. On the contrary, there's a sort of descending degree of relatedness as you go further away. So there are two different things in theory. There are two different things in practice, in animal behaviour, in human psychology. There's no reason to. Again, I think the onus is on anyone who would want to say they are the same thing when they're clearly not.
Really interesting.
And you said about authority too. So yeah, it is the case that's in somewhere in one of the earlier papers, Jonathan Haidt talks when he's talking about authority. He does mention heroism, but that doesn't translate into the questionnaire. So there's no items about asking about the morality of heroism of those hawkish signals in the questionnaire. The questionnaire is just about the dovish side, just about showing respect to authority. So they are two sides of the same coin, but only one side of the coin ends up. And you only see one side of the coin in moral foundations theory.
Interesting. And how about what do you make of the purity and division, or purity and divinity types in moral foundations theory and in Shweder's work?
Well, I mean, I think there's something going on there, but it's a grab bag of all kinds of different things. And my suspicion is that when it's analysed properly, it doesn't make sense theoretically to treat it as a single category, for a variety of reasons. On the face of it, disgust has got nothing to do with cooperation. So even in moral foundation terms, it's an anomalous category. And Jonathan Haidt says it's an odd corner of morality because it doesn't have to do with social relations. But there's many disgusting things that aren't immoral. If you encounter rotten fruit, you might be disgusted, but there's nothing immoral about it. It only becomes moral. Disgust only becomes a moral issue when it has to do with social behaviour. If for example, if somebody is sick and they're not covering their mouth while they're coughing near you, and hence putting your health at risk, putting your life at risk, then it becomes a moral issue. And disgust isn't unique to those kinds of issues either. People can be disgusted by free riders. They can be disgusted by out-group members or people that betray the in-group. They can disgust as an avoidance strategy, which can be used to avoid all kinds of bad guys from all the other cooperative domains. It isn't just unique to that slightly mysterious, mystical domain of purity.
Yeah, interesting. And so how, as somebody who's not an evolutionary psychologist and not well-versed in that literature, how are these 7 different types of cooperation discovered? How exhaustive are they anticipated to be?
You mean is 7? Are we done with 7, or do you think?
Yeah. I'm asking. Well, I guess it was two parts. So one is how are these 7 different categories uncovered in the first place? Is it just done by, oh, hey, it seems like people like to return favors, so let's run an experiment on this, and then we see this in a bunch of different species, and that's how reciprocity is discovered? Or how is it? I mean, evolutionary theory is usually working from just observations, then going back to testing it with empirical analyses, right?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, like science in general, it starts with starts with a theory, it starts with a conjecture, and the 7 well-established types of cooperation I've been talking about are all examples of good examples of theories that have been put to the test and received empirical support. And certainly they could be more. One of my bugbears is that 90% of the work in this area is focused on reciprocity and prisoner's dilemma, which is great and interesting, but it's completely overshadowing all the other types of cooperation and morality out there. And I hope that it's certainly possible that if people broaden their horizons and started investigating these other games, they could come up with all kinds of additional discoveries.
Yeah. Okay. So, what then? Like, one comment you had made about the other theories is that there isn't an underlying theory behind them. So, like with moral foundations theory, it's like they're just trying to kind of observe shots in the dark of what kinds of moral foundations are out there. And I guess I'm wondering what sets that apart, since moral foundations theory also claims to kind of be based, at least loosely, off of evolutionary theory. What sets that apart from what you're putting forward here? And I'm assuming the answer is because yours is more grounded in game theory in particular.
Yeah, so all I'm doing is saying if we're going to, in order to develop the best cooperative theory of morality, let's start with the mathematics of cooperation. And when you do, you identify 7 or more types, and then you're off to the races. Why would you do anything different? Why, instead of doing that, would you say, I'm going to read a handful of books and record my impressions as to what's in them? Jonathan Haidt says in one paper that he explicitly says this was an ad hoc approach. And he explicitly defends taking an ad hoc approach. He says he something like he rejects on principle a principled approach. So that's how that's not the best way to start doing science. And again, why would you do it any differently? Especially if you end up with identifying fewer of the obvious moral domains.
Yeah. So, how are you taking your work with morality as cooperation and these 7 different cooperation principles? How are you taking that and applying it to empirical work?
Right. Well, so they're a long time coming, but this year we just published a couple of big projects. So one was a psychology paper developing a morality as cooperation questionnaire, where we develop a 7-factor measure of these different moral domains and show that it outperforms the moral foundations questionnaire on a number of key metrics. So not least that it measures a wider variety of moral dispositions, but it performs better in a number of criteria too. So the second paper was recently published in Current Anthropology, and we looked to see whether these 7 types of cooperation were moral universals, whether people around the world considered them morally good, as opposed to more extreme versions of moral relativism, which would say that morality means radically different things in different places. And lo and behold, we found that we read through thousands of paragraphs, millions of words of ethnographic accounts of ethics from 60 cultures around the world, and found about 1,000 examples of these cooperative behaviours. And in 99.9% of the cases, these 7 types of cooperation were considered morally good. We found examples of most of these in most societies, and found them evenly distributed all around the world. So it is very strong evidence that these are indeed, these are not merely Western inventions, and morality doesn't vary radically. Instead, these seem to be a sort of a common core of universal moral principles that everyone everywhere agrees on.
That's fascinating. So how that was, was it a human coder that was going through these texts, or was there some sort of like a program going through it?
There were 3 humans going through them.
Wow, that's like a massive amount of work. That's impressive.
Well, it's one of those projects where if I'd known how much work it's going to be, I would have started it, but it was too late to stop.
Yeah, well, here you are now, and you can say you've done it, and that's really, really cool. Awesome. So then you would also mention, I'm curious, like, cross-cultural differences in how these different types of cooperation are emphasized or not as strongly used in a lot of cases. Could you tell me about that? How they vary in degree across cultures?
Yeah, so we didn't test that directly, but I don't have data on that at the moment. But the theory is just that moral values reflect the value of cooperation. So different people in different societies who benefit from different types of cooperation will have different moral values. People who live in extended kin networks, in small-scale, stable societies when they're always interacting with the same people and there's a sort of clear dominance hierarchy, will put a lot of emphasis on, will rank highly, will prioritize their duties to kin, their loyalty to their group, their deference to the chief and that kind of thing. Whereas people more like us who live in vast anonymous conurbations where most of our interactions are with anonymous strangers, those kinds of moral values we still understand them, we still get the idea of deference and of obligations to family, but they don't loom as large as the rules for interacting with strangers, like reciprocity or fairness. And so that's the straightforward prediction from the theory. I currently have a couple of projects underway that's going to be using the moralities cooperation questionnaire to gather new data from, in one case, 40 European countries, and so we'll begin to be able to test that and to understand the cross-cultural differences a bit more.
Very cool. So can you tell me a bit more about that questionnaire? Like, what is it? A Likert scale? Is it like story-based? What is that?
It's exactly the same format as the Moral Foundations questionnaire. So we wanted to, Moral Foundations gets a lot of things right, and we've so far been talking about the things that are wrong and how you might have a new and improved evolutionary account of morality. But we wanted to just go. We just wanted to go sort of head to head with the Moral Foundations questionnaire. So we had the Moralities Cooperation questionnaire has the same format. So there's a relevance scale and a judgment scale. It has the same questions and same format of items, albeit with different items and different domains. Yeah.
So what are some of the items that you have on that questionnaire? I'm just curious what examples from each of those are. Like, especially the ones that I'm less familiar with, like a hawkish contest, possession. Possession seems straightforward, but haven't heard a question on things like that. So,
yeah. Okay. So, for example, the family items include you should always put the interests of your family first. People should be willing to do anything to help a member of their family. The reciprocity items are you have an obligation. These are all Likert questions. So, do you agree or disagree?
Okay.
Do you agree that you have an obligation to help those who have helped you? You should always make amends for things you've done wrong. You should always return a favour if you can. The heroism items are include courage in the face of adversity is the most admirable trait. Society should do more to honour its heroes, which I think might be similar to an MFT
Interesting.
And those are the judgment items, and then similarly for the relevance items. So when you're making a moral decision, to what extent is it relevant? Whether or not someone helped a member of their family, whether or not someone did what they'd agreed to do as a reciprocity item, whether or not someone acted heroically.
Interesting. So after talking to Tejrai was on this podcast, and after talking to him about his theory, I thought it was really interesting, in particular, what he was saying about the unity relational model and how that simultaneously has people have a motivation to draw closer to their in-group and to kind of freely share with that in-group, but also to set themselves apart from an out-group. And so it was kind of a double-edged sword. And I'm going back to the question I had asked about like cross-cultural differences. I'm wondering about this aspect of the cooperation paradigm as well. It seems like when we're talking about morality, these different types of cooperation will butt heads a lot of times. And so what is good on one level is often detrimental on another level. Is that a problem for, like, from an evolutionary perspective, is it a problem that helping your kin might conflict with helping a broader group?
I don't think it is a problem. I think it's exactly what the theory would predict. So, people are faced with a range of different cooperative problems or opportunities, and it's often the case they conflict and they have to choose between them. Should I help my family or should I help my group? So that's what moral dilemmas are made of. And so we would expect people to feel conflicted when they're trying to decide, should they be deferential to their boss, or should they report that he's been cheating? Should they be a whistleblower? Should they the classic Heinz dilemma? Should they help their families, or should they help their families if that means stealing property from someone? So, of course, these types of cooperation, people often have to choose between these opportunities, and that creates dilemmas. And it's the same with when it's also the case that people can cooperate to be uncooperative. So, for example, there's honor amongst thieves. So thieves can trust one another and respect one another and all the rest, but they're working together, for example, to rob a bank, to break property rules. So when we look at that as a neutral observer, we could do all the things. So we can explain why these robbers might feel the way they do, might feel the moral emotions that they do to one another. But also, when we pan out and we consider the interests not just of the robbers, but the interests of the robbers and the owners of the bank or society at large, we can see, on balance, this is an uncooperative outcome. There's some local morality there, but it was in the service of this uncooperative act. And when we weigh up, as it were, the greater good, we can conclude that the robbers were in the wrong, doing something immoral. On balance, they were doing something uncooperative. They were wrong to do.
So how would you hope that other scholars kind of pick up on this work and start to incorporate it into their own to kind of push the science of morality forward?
Yeah, well, I hope that they pick it up and try and test the theory to destruction. I think that that cooperation is the best theory we have of morality. But what do I know? So the more brains are involved in it, either adding other types of cooperation to it or distinguishing subtypes of cooperation, the better. Like I said, at the moment, people are cycloptically focused on reciprocity at the expense of all these other things. So I hope that other researchers broaden their horizons a bit and consider, start thinking about moral obligations to family, start thinking more explicitly about heroism, and putting all these things together. Obviously, people have looked at these different things in isolation, but what they haven't done is pull them all together to have this sort of richer palette.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of specific things, I mean, I've always dreamt of being able to look at the A to Z of morality. So I'm interested in the genetic basis of these traits. How heritable are they? I'm interested in how they develop. At what point do you see them emerging in kids? I'm interested in how and why moral values vary, across time and across cultures. I'm interested in whether you can apply the same cooperative framework to, as it were, other flavours of morality, to sexual morality and to environmental ethics, for example. So I'm involved in projects looking at some of all of those things, but there shouldn't just be one person or one research group testing this this variety of theories. It should be the more the merrier.
Right. Are you aware of other research groups out there using your paradigm?
A few inklings, a few green shoots. So there was recently a paper by Leanne Young and Ryan McManus, I think one was the first author, looking a fascinating paper looking at explicitly bringing moral obligations to family. And they found that if you ask how moral is somebody who saves a stranger from a building, as opposed to how moral is someone who saves a family member from a building, people tend to say, "Oh, the person that saves the stranger, that's amazing. That's much more admirable. They're more moral than someone who saves a family member." However, if you ask the same question, but this time the person, as it were, runs into the building and has to choose between either saving the family member or the stranger, then they get the opposite result. So if you go into a building and ignore your family member and pull a stranger out, people think you're a moral monster.
Right. Yeah.
So the short implication is it's almost, taking care of your family is so taken for granted. It's such the default position that you, as it were, you don't get any special plaudits for doing it. But boy, you get in trouble if you don't do it. If you neglect to do that.
Very interesting.
That's an example of adding an extra dimension to their understanding of moral psychology. And they had, as a sort of extra bonus, they included the Moralities and Cooperation Questionnaire in their study and found that the degree to which people endorsed the family domain predicted their responses in this dilemma.
Yeah.
So that's an example of, let's make morality a bit more multicolored and include all these different impulses. Yeah,
that's really cool. You had mentioned you're doing a little bit of work in a number of the things that you had laid out. So you had also mentioned work in sexuality with this. Are you working on that now?
In the early stages with Daniel Sneezer, who's done great work on pride and shame and moral emotions. So we're looking to see whether you can understand sexual morality as cooperation about sex, as promoting cooperative relations within and between the sexes.
Interesting. So could you just spell that out a little bit more for me? What is, because between I understand kin, how does sexuality play into some of these other cooperation forms?
Yeah, so some people think of sexual morality as a completely different category altogether, and they can't imagine what cooperation has to do with it. I'm not so sure, and I think that on closer inspection, lots of bits of sexual morality will turn out to be exactly the same kinds of cooperative solutions, because the same problems arise, sometimes explicitly so. So, for example, marriage is a contract. It's a kind of reciprocal exchange. And the people who break that contract are called cheats. It's not a coincidence. There's a great paper by Joe Henrik talking about monogamy. Monogamy is a kind of fairness. It's as he so implicitly argues that instead of having a big fight as to who's going to have the most mates, let's all agree to have one each. So monogamy is a way of resolving conflicts or forestalling conflicts between members of society and thereby reducing the cost of those conflicts and promoting greater good. So lots of bits of sexual morality are just straightforward examples of cooperation where the resource at issue is sex or sexual access as opposed to other things like food or territory and so on. Yeah, so it's still a work in progress, but there's a hefty paragraph on sexual morality in the reply to the commentaries in our current Anthropology article. So that, if you like, is an abstract of forthcoming attractions.
Very cool. Really, really interesting stuff. So I'm also curious, just backtracking a bit here, have you ever had the opportunity to speak with the Moral Foundations folks or the Relational Models folks or Shweder about this work and your criticisms of their work?
No, I haven't had the opportunity to speak to them. Jonathan Haidt tweeted to say he was looking forward to responding to some of my criticisms that appeared in a behavioural scientist paper criticising moral foundations theory. But I'm waiting with bated breath because he hasn't replied as yet. But I know he's a busy person.
Yeah, that would be. I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to say about this. It'll, I think, be very fascinating.
Cool. To their credit, they explicitly acknowledge that the five foundations that they started with, they don't report that, they don't pretend that those. They explicitly say this is not going to be the final word. There may well be additional ones. So I think in some respects, he would welcome these constructive developments. Yeah, he does seem to be open-minded. I haven't interacted with him one-on-one, but from what other people have said about his feedback on their theories and things like that, it seems like he is a very open-minded scholar, which is good. So, yeah, I think he's generally a force for good in the world, but I think that moral psychology could be better still.
Yeah, of course, right? You've got your own theory, so. Well, awesome. Oliver, thank you so much. I think that, we're at time here, but thank you so much. I appreciate your conversation. I think this is really helpful and interesting. I've never really come across another theory that tries to break morality down to mathematics. And so I think that that's a really unique contribution that has a lot of potential. And I'm definitely going to be looking into this more and chewing on it more in the coming weeks. So thanks so much for giving me the best intro into it, getting to talk right to the source.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me and letting me know what you want.
Okay, great. Thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or requests, contact me at www.moralsciencepodcast.com. The Moral Science Podcast is sponsored by ERA Inc., a research and design think tank that's reinventing how people interact with each other. Music throughout the program is My Kruby by Shweder and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.